Morning all, and welcome to the Crystalline and Silica webinar as part of the National Asbestos Awareness Week 2024. On the 15th of December 2023, ASIA, the Asbestos Safety Eradication Agency functions were expanded to include silica and silica-related disease through amendment of the Asbestos and Silica Safety and Eradication Agency Act 2013. The agency name was also changed to the Asbestos and Silica Safety and Eradication Agency. The agency has transitioned to coordinate, monitor and report on national efforts to eliminate both asbestos and silica-related disease in Australia and support those affected by those diseases. The silica functions will be achieved via the Silica National Strategic Plan, which has been developed and endorsed, and the National Plan sets out the priority work to achieve this aim and is for implementation by Commonwealth, state and territory governments. As part of the Asbestos Awareness Week 2024, the purpose of today's webinar is to assist asbestos removal licence holders and demolition contractors understand their duties related to the WHS silica regulations. I'll stipulate that again. This is toned and focused towards asbestos removalist organisations and those asbestos organisations that tend to also have a gamut for demolition as well. If you're looking for something more, please sit in on this webinar. It'll still serve value to it. But when I speak about references and toning, it's all about asbestos removal and demolition. Speakers will be myself, and I'm the manager of the construction and utilities team. George Philippou to my right is WHS inspector with the high risk work team, and Richard Carey-Clark's a principal occupational hygienist, and he's online somewhere out there. So this is going to be a long, dry webinar. I'm literally going to go through this regulation by regulation, spell it out, explain it and provide some detail to this. What I'm asking you to do questions-wise is wait till the end of the presentation. I believe you also have the ability to do some online stuff. Please fire your questions away online and we'll try and answer those in the background as we go through the presentation.
Yeah, just in the chat tab, people, at the end of the session, just chuck it in the chat and I'll field the questions, and Richard, who will have access to them as well, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can.
Rightio, Chapter 8A, Crystalline Silica. Previously on the 1st of July, regulations outlining the prohibition of engineered stone, porcelain and sintered stone came into effect in South Australia. The engineered stone regulations provide a transition period specific to certain conditions and activities with engineered stone. That transition period ceases at the end of 2024. On the 1st of September 2024, new regulations came into effect that provide additional obligations on a PCBU who carries out work with crystalline silica substances, or CSS, as well as engineered stone. The silica regulations do not have a transition period in South Australia. 529A, the meaning of processing in relation to crystalline silica substances and related terms. Part 1. In these regulations, processing in relation to a CSS means A, the use of power tools or mechanical plant to carry out an activity involving the crushing, cutting, grinding, trimming, sanding, abrasive polishing, or drilling of a CSS. So to give you some examples of what I'm implying in that, and I'm not saying this is limited, excavation, earth moving and drilling plant operations, clay, sand and stone processing machine operations, cutting and laying of pavers and surfacing, mining, quarrying and mineral ore treating processes, road construction and tunnelling, construction, building and demolition involving a CSS, brick, concrete or stone cutting, abrasive blasting, blasting agent must not contain greater than 1% silica, foundry casting, angle grinding, jackhammering and chiselling of concrete or masonry, hydraulic fracturing of gas and oil wells, pottery, crushing, loading, hauling and dumping of rock or muck from tunnelling, and clean-up activities such as sweeping or pressurised air blowing of dust containing crystalline silica. Based on that, ask yourself, could your work activity involve any processing as per the regulations, keeping in mind that this part that I've just explained comes into effect for demolition contractors and asbestos removal activities. Part B, the use of road headers to excavate material that is a CSS, the quarrying of a material that is a CSS, mechanical screening involving a material that is a CSS, tunnelling through a material that is a CSS, or a process that exposes or is reasonably likely to expose a person to respiratory silica during the manufacture or handling of a CSS. That clause there covers quite a broad gamut of activities. 529A, meaning of processing in relation to crystalline silica substances and related terms, Part 2. In these regulations, crystalline silica substance, or CSS, means material that contains at least 1% crystalline silica, determined as a weight-for-weight concentration. Note, engineered stone is a type of CSS. In these regulations, crystalline silica means a crystalline polymorphs of silica and includes the following substances. And excuse my ignorance if I pronounce these substances incorrectly, but I'm not a science guru. So cristobalite, quartz, tridymite, tripoli. In these regulations, engineered stone means a CSS that is an artificial product and is created by combining natural stone materials with other chemical constitutions such as water, resin or pigment, and becomes hardened. But in these regulations, engineered stone does not include the following: concrete and cement products, brick pavers and other similar blocks, ceramic walls and floor tiles, grout, mortar and render, plasterboard, porcelain products, sintered stone and roof tiles. In these regulations, the processing of a CSS is controlled if at least one of the following measures are used during the processing: the isolation of a person from dust exposure, a fully enclosed operator cabin fitted with a high efficiency air filtration system, an effective wet dust suppression method, an effective on-tool extraction system, an effective local exhaust ventilation system, and a person still at risk of being exposed to respiratory CCS after one or more of the measures in paragraph B that I've just referred to are used, is provided with RPE or PPE and wears the RPE equipment whilst the work activity is being carried out. Despite sub-regulation 1, if the measures in sub-regulation 1B are not reasonably practicable, The processing of a CSS is controlled if the person who is at risk of being exposed to the silica during the processing is provided with RPE and wears the RPE equipment while the work is carried out. Ask yourself, and this is to the demolition domain and the removalists out there, ask yourself, is the neighbour next door to a residential demolition process that is not effectively controlled, are they being exposed to silica during that processing? Ask yourself, if your controls are not reasonably practicable and you rely on RPE, will that worker wear that mask all day if required during a high-risk processing activity like demolition? And please note that the use of RPE equipment as the only control measure for processing a CSS will only satisfy the requirements for controlled processing if circumstances where none of the isolation and engineering controls prescribed in the regulations are reasonably practicable. To rely on RPE only, you should be able to demonstrate you have considered isolation and engineering controls and be able to explain why the implementation of such high order controls is not reasonably practicable in the circumstances. Please note the use of RPE will require fit testing requirements for workers similar to as you deal with in asbestos. When processing of CSS is controlled, in this regulation, RPE means PPE that is designed to prevent a person wearing the equipment from inhaling airborne contaminants and complies with AS 1716-2012 and AS 1715-2009. Regulation 44, 45 and 46 apply to this provision and the use of personnel protective equipment, including the RPE equipment provided under sub-regulation 1C and 2. (529C) Duty for processing of a CSS to be controlled. PCBU must not carry out or direct or allow a worker to carry out processing of a CSS unless the processing is controlled. Just a quick job cutting up concrete footpaths with a demo saw or cutting up Hebel on a construction site with no controls implemented now has a regulation and a penalty attached to it. This means the amount that you as an individual or as a body corporate can be prosecuted for if SafeWork SA were to take the avenue for prosecution in relation to a breach of these regulations. Please note that the silica regulations have no expiation penalty applied to any regulations. It's only a prosecution option for us. (529CA) Identifying processing of a CSS that is high risk. A person conducting a business or undertaking at a workplace must assess the processing of a CSS carried out by the business or the undertaking at the workplace to determine if the processing is high risk. To confirm processing would be deemed the task of the activity conducted in working with the CSS as per regulation 529A. An assessment must be done for each processing activity and product type containing silica. A, the use of power tools or mechanical equipment to carry out the activity involving the crushing, cutting, grinding, trimming, sanding, abrasive polishing or drilling of the CSS. Or F, a process that exposes or is reasonably likely to expose a person to respiratory silica during the manufacture or handling of a CSS. Examples for asbestos removal are the removal of a freestanding deep six fence is the processing activity to remove the cement sheeting that contains CSS, that contains asbestos, and is a very different activity compared to breaking up a ceramic tiled floor to gain access to asbestos tiles and blackjack stuck to a concrete floor. Examples for house demolition. The demolition of a brick home using an excavator with a bucket grab attachment to bring down the house to ground level is the activity to demolish bricks, roofing tiles, mortar, wall tiles, cement sheeting that all contain CSS, and is a very different activity compared to breaking up the home's concrete slabs and footings using an excavator with a ripper attachment and a hydraulic hammer attachment. And again, loading out a demolition material and soil containing CSS in a truck using an excavator with a bucket is a different processing activity. Part 2, in assessing whether the processing of a CSS is a high risk, the person must have regard to the following: the specific processing that will be undertaken. Note, specific processing. The form or forms of crystalline silica present in the CSS. The proportion of crystalline silica contained in that CSS, determined as a weight-for-weight concentration. The hazards associated with the work, including the likely frequency and duration that a person will be exposed to the crystalline silica. SafeWork Australia provides a template for identifying and documenting the process of CSS that is high risk, and I personally recommend you use that document. SafeWork Australia identifies high risk as where the airborne concentration of RCS is reasonably likely to exceed half of the silica workplace exposure standards. So that would be 0.025 cubic metres over an 8-hour time-weighted average. The maximum WES limit is 0.05 milligrams per 3 cubic metre. PCBUs need to complete some kind of air monitoring to determine the WES and find out if it is high risk. A workplace exposure standard represents a concentration of an airborne hazardous chemical within a worker's breathing zone that should not cause adverse health effects or undue harm if they're under those limits. PCBUs must not take into account any protection provided by administrative controls or RPE when considering the airborne concentrations of RCS in the workplace. So basically, when you do these assessments, you don't factor in the controls that you may implement. In assessing whether the processing of the CSS is high risk, the person must have regard to the following: whether the airborne concentration of RCS that is present at the workplace is reasonably likely to exceed half the WES. Any relevant air monitoring results may previously have been undertaken at the workplace. Any previous incidents, illness or disease associated with the exposure to the RCS at the workplace. And when I'm referring to at the workplace, it is your workplace. 529 CA, identifying processing of a CSS that is high risk. In assessing whether the processing of a CSS is high risk, the person must not rely on the control measures implemented under Regulation 529B1B. So in respect to pressurised cabs using water, that doesn't get factored in during this assessment process. You must also have regard to the use of PPE and administrative controls used to control the risks associated with the RCS. So basically, do not factor in and include the controls from 1B or any RPE as part of your assessment. The assessment determination is based on not having any controls being in place. Part 4, next parts, we'll get to those. The person must ensure that a risk assessment conducted under sub-regulation 1 is recorded in writing. And if a person conducting a business or undertaking is unable to determine whether the processing of the CCS carried out at the workplace is high risk, the processing is taken to be high risk until the person determines that the processing is not high risk. So for part 4, it must be documented, and those assessments will need to be available on request. If you cannot determine if the processing is high risk, then basically call it high risk till it's proven otherwise. (529) Silica Risk Control Plan required for processing of a CSS that is high risk. The PCBU carrying out the processing of a CSS that is high risk must, before the processing commences, ensure that a silica risk control plan for the processing is A, prepared, or already been prepared by another person. A template, silica control templates available through SafeWork Australia's website. Again, I would personally recommend you use that. The silica control plan must identify all the processing activities of a CCS carried out at the workplace that is high risk, and include the risk assessment undertaken under Regulation 529 CA for all processing of a CSS that is high risk, and document what control measures will be used to control the risks associated with the processing that is high risk, and how those measures will be implemented, monitored and reviewed, and be set out and expressed in a way that is readily accessible and understandable to persons who use it. The control plan is not required to be prepared before the processing of a CCS that is high risk if the processing that is high risk is also high risk construction work and a safe work method statement is prepared or has already been prepared by another person before the processing commences, and the safe work method statement satisfies the requirements in sub-regulation 2. So in a nutshell, that SWIMS, you are entitled to use a SWIMS document as your control plan for the activities. The content of that SWIMS must match the intent and the requirements and everything that's required to be documented in your control plan. You can use either option. I give a preference personally for the SafeWork Australia template, and I'm basing that on my personal opinion, for it's probably a simpler, easier step and to action and for people to understand. 529CC, compliance with the silica control plan. A person conducting or a PCBU carrying out the processing of a CSS that is high risk must put in place arrangements for ensuring that processing is carried out in accordance with the control plan, including by ensuring that the control plan is available to all workers and provided to all workers before they commence the processing. Your duty holders for that, to make sure that control plan's being carried out the way it should be would be your supervisionary staff. If the processing of the CSS that is high risk is not carried out in accordance with the silica control plan that applies to the processing of the PCBU, or the person must ensure that the processing is stopped immediately or as soon as it is safe to do so, and resumed only in accordance with the control plan. So when you identify things aren't going according to the plan, you must stop that activity. You must stop immediately as soon as it's safe to do so, and you can only resume the activity once it's back online with the control plan and complying with that. A person or a PCBU must ensure that a control plan is reviewed and, as necessary, revised if relevant control measures are revised under Regulation 3A. To give you an example of reasons why you may review your plan: new job site location, known incidents and complaints, changes to your controls, breach of air monitoring WES limits, or additionally requests made by workers or other staff. 529 CD, duty to train workers about risks of crystalline silica. The PCBU must ensure that a worker receives crystalline silica training if the person reasonably believes that the worker may be involved in the process that is high risk, or be at risk of exposure to RCS because of the processing of the CSS that is high risk. So basically, if the worker is involved in processing of CSS that is high risk, the worker must be trained. If the worker is not involved in processing of CSS that is high risk, however, is at risk of exposure, they still need to be trained. Ask yourself, how easy would it be for a worker to be inadvertently exposed to dust, however not directly involved in the activity? Whilst this training is not a regulatory requirement in the context of working on a construction site and the requirement to have a white card training, please consider the reality and likelihood of workers without training inadvertently being exposed to the activity. There is a significant benefit to training workers to install a level of silica knowledge with all workers in industry. Duty to train workers about the risk of CSS. The person must ensure that the records are kept for the training undertaken by the worker. And while the worker is carrying out that processing of the CSS that is high risk, and you must keep the records for 5 years after the day the worker or employee ceases working for you as a PCBU. The person must keep the record available for inspection under the Act. As we do with silica correction asbestos control plans, people tend to keep a hard copy of any qualifications on site with as part of that control plan. I would recommend you do the same with your silica control plan. In this regulation, crystalline silica training means training that is accredited or training approved by the regulator in relation to the following: the health risks associated with exposure to RCS, and the need for and the proper use of any risk control measures required by the regulations. (529) CE, monitoring in relation to processing of the CSS that is a high risk. PCBU that is carrying out or directing or allowing a worker to carry out the processing of the CSS that is high risk must undertake air monitoring for RCS in accordance with Regulation 50 and provide air monitoring results to the regulator in a form approved by the regulator if the airborne concentration of RCS has exceeded the WES as soon as reasonably practicable and no more than 14 days from the date that the air monitoring results were reported to the PCBU. When must air monitoring occur? During your assessment process to determine whether the activity is high risk. If you cannot find evidence during that process that the controls will work to eliminate and minimise silica dust, you should conduct air monitoring to validate the process controls that you're implementing are effective. Air monitoring is conducted in the form of personal air monitoring of workers' breathing zone. The worker will wear an air monitor during the work activity, and that will determine whether WESs are inside limits or outside. Static air monitoring, similar to static air monitoring undertaken during asbestos removal activities, could also be used to ensure silica dust is being controlled in the general area of the activity. Static monitoring would be an effective method to validate silica dust is not encroaching on the neighbouring properties. Changes in process controls warrant air monitoring the process to ensure the change in the control process is still effective. Use air monitoring for ongoing validation of your controls to ensure they are effective. Ask yourself, can you use air monitoring to protect yourself from allegations that processes were not controlled in the environments where perceived risk by the public could occur? Keep in mind a person that believes they are exposed under Regulation 50 can request air monitoring results. If air monitoring results indicate the airborne concentration has exceeded the WES, SafeWork SA must be informed of this event. SafeWork SA has an online form that can be used to notify the regulator. Health monitoring must be provided to all workers involved directly with this high-risk CSS processing, and also consider those workers who are regularly in the vicinity of the activity and have their health monitoring conducted. And to clarify something, in case this question comes up later, for asbestos removalists out there that do health monitoring related to asbestos workers, that health monitoring that you have done for a worker working with asbestos is not the same health monitoring done for someone who has silica or is working with silica. There is an additional requirement to do a chest x-ray above and beyond what you do for an asbestos medical assessment. So you can't claim that your asbestos medical assessment of a worker is going to be suitable and tick the boxes to determine silica health monitoring. You must do separate health monitoring to get your staff to tick that box for that regulation. And going forward from there, you could, if your workers do both asbestos and silica work, you could combine their medicals in the future together and try and keep it all into one. A person conducting a business or undertaking or directing or allowing a worker to carry out the processing of a CCS that is high risk must provide health monitoring, and we've pretty well just spoken about that. And I thought I'd throw in Regulation 50 just to give you an understanding of what that is. So a PCBU must ensure that air monitoring is carried out to determine the airborne concentration of a substance or mixture at the workplace to which an exposure standard applies if the person is not certain on reasonable grounds whether or not the airborne concentration of exposure or the mixture at the workplace exceeds the relevant exposure standard, or monitoring is necessary to determine whether there is a risk to health. Penalties involved, and you'll note now that under Regulation 50, expiation fees plus prosecution fees can be applied. The person conducting a PCBU must ensure that the results of the air monitoring carried out under Sub-Regulation 1 are recorded and kept for 30 years after the date the record is made. The PCBU must ensure that the results of air monitoring carried out under Sub-Regulation 1 are readily accessible to persons at the workplace who may be exposed to the substance or mixture. And that pretty well ends the first part of this webinar in relation to the regulations as word for word as it is and as dry as it is. The next part of the webinar is to try and condense and simplify the regulations from a demolition perspective and an asbestos removalist perspective. And the reason I'm doing both is it is not unusual for the PCBU that conducts asbestos removal to also have an additional task where they demolish the property once they've removed the asbestos. The reality is, if you're purely an asbestos removalist, this regulation, the silica regulations, still apply to you. So the question is, does asbestos removal or demolition activities have any regulatory implications under the crystalline silica regulations? And you'll note that's a deep six fence, contains asbestos. And I've blanked out the name on the excavator arm, but that's a PCBU doing a house demolition. And I'd just like to clarify that's not clouds against a blue sky. That is silica dust blowing in the breeze from the demolition activity. The answer for both activities to my question is simply yes. Most common ACM removal activities involve the removal of cement sheeting. Note that wording, cement sheeting that contains asbestos. The cement sheeting is likely to contain over 1% crystalline silica content. There is potentially a range of other situations that you may be forced to work with products containing silica to complete asbestos removal work. These could include situations such as the removal of floor tiles containing silica to access asbestos under those floor tiles. Asbestos tiles stuck to concrete floors that can include the removal of blackjack stuck to the concrete floor and how the removal process impacts the concrete floor. The removal of and or working with wall tiles containing silica to access and or remove wet areas cement sheeting containing asbestos. As a licensed removalist, you will now need to take into consideration how you will meet your regulatory obligations under the silica regulations in relation to the scope of works you could undertake during your removal activities. As a demo contractor, every demolition process, i.e. your average residential demo job, you conduct involves numerous materials containing over 1% crystalline silica content. You're pretty well in it. There's no avoiding it. To demo a property, you've basically got to comply with the silica regulations. Please keep in mind that every demo job is likely to have neighbours impacted by that activity, and if your controls are not effective, you are exposing persons outside of the direct work area from the CCS processing activity. This flowchart's available through the SafeWork Australia guidance material. I've just done a copy and paste out of the document and put that in as a simple, or I believe a relatively simple flowchart to help PCBUs understand determination of what is high risk and what is not high risk, and what you must do if it's high risk and what you need to do if it's not high risk. I'll also note or provide you with this information. I'm aware of all the regulators and SafeWork Australia currently working on a silica and engineered stone code of practice. I have seen a draft version of that document personally. That document's still not signed off, finalised and approved for use, but just to make you aware that they are working on a code of practice to support these regulations. My thanks to Macquash. I've poached some of their material. So there's a hierarchy of dust controls. So this gives you a good demonstration and understanding of elimination, substitution, isolation, engineering controls, administrative controls and PPE controls in the context of managing silica dust. Not so much about other risks, it's focused on the dust elements. Managing and complying with silica regulations around asbestos removal and demolition work. What do you need to do? Your first step is the documented risk assessment under Regulation 529CA. Determine if the processing of the CSS is a high risk. The assessment will need to have regard to the specific processing that will be undertaken, the form or forms of silica present in the material, the proportion of crystalline silica contained in the CSS determined as a weight-for-weight concentration, and the hazards associated with the work, including the likely frequency and duration that a person will be exposed. So your first step is to assess and determine whether it's high risk. If first step is a documented risk assessment, blah, blah, blah. The assessment will also need to have regard to whether the airborne concentration of RCS that is present at the workplace is reasonably likely to exceed the WES. Any relevant air and health monitoring previously undertaken at the workplace. So if you've done previous air monitoring, then that can be taken into account against what task you're doing, or any previous incidents, illness or diseases associated with exposure to RCS at the workplace. And you must record the assessment in writing, including how you have considered the factors I've just detailed and the reasons why the processing is determined to be high risk or not high risk. Second step is to develop a silica control plan under Regulation 529CB. If you have assessed the processing of the CCS or a combination of processing of CCS as being high risk, you must develop a silica risk control plan covering these processing tasks that you're about to undertake. Alternatively, you can use the SWIMS document, but bear in mind that the SWIMS document must be equal to or better than the content requirements of the silica control plan. And you're only allowed to use the SWIMS document in the context of a high-risk construction activity, of which demolition activities applies and can have a SWIMS for that, and also the removal of asbestos, you require a SWIMS for that. And again, my personal preference, this is just my personal preference, not the regulator speaking, go with the control plan, nice simple document, outlines a bouncing ball process for you to follow. third step is to ensure compliance with the silica control plan under Regulation 529CC. You must put in place arrangements to ensure that the plan is available to all workers and provided to all workers before they commence that processing. It must be set out in such a way that it's simplistic and understandable by the persons who use it. Once the control plan is in place, you must ensure that the processing of that CSS is carried out in accordance with that plan. Bear in mind, if it's not being conducted as per that plan, the activity must stop and it can only recommence once the being brought in line with that plan again. And that's about it. The other factors you need to take into account, you need to have your staff trained and you need to have your staff health assessed against silica. And that's about it for the webinar. I have in this webinar a range of resources and I'll quickly brief through those. I'm not going to go and enter the sites or that. I'll just quickly give you a rundown
I'll share at the end
of what's out there, and it will be available online. You can be able to click the link and it'll take you there. So SafeWork SA's website. There's a link there to the respirable crystalline silica and the silica substances regulations. There is also a very handy link for sourcing and engaging WH professionals. And this doesn't just apply to silica. It's a good central hub to source professionals that can help you with the silica regulations. It also has a broad range of sound professional guidance material. I found that. The other link there is to SafeWork SA's notification if you were to exceed the WES, and that can be done online. SafeWork Australia, working with crystalline silica substance and a silica dust resource document. All the templates that I've been referring to are also available from the SafeWork Australia website. And the following training courses, these are linked, but I'll just quickly go through them. So the only courses that South Australian regulator has accepted and has been approved for training
CITC
is the 10830 NAT course in crystalline silica exposure, and there are also 2 units of competency for working with silica material and also a supervise and manage unit of competency. So to confirm, I did a bit of a search for this out in the realm of South Australia. So for the nationally accredited course, there is only one training provider currently providing this in South Australia at the moment, and I don't represent RTOs and what other RTOs might come online. But to speed up the process, I'll put a name to that RTO just to save a lot of people. It is CITC. I'm also aware that South Australia does accept face-to-face training. It will also accept if you do these courses online. I am aware of one RTO within Australia that provides these courses online, and I don't recall the name off the top of my head, but they can be tracked down with a good Google search. I'm also aware of other RTOs that have South Australia on their scopes to deliver this training. So those RTOs could attend South Australia and deliver training in the context of face-to-face for a PCBU. Other resources: silica dust for the Cancer Council, silicosis for the Lung Foundation Australia, and there's quite a good range of guidance material information out there on the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency. And that's the end of the webinar for me doing all the talking now.
I've got 4 questions ready to go, and we can jump into them straight away.
Go for it.
Yeah. Tim Wilson. So questions. There's a Q&A section here, guys. If you want to just pop whatever questions in there, I'll read them out. If Richard, if you want to jump in with anything, but we'll try and field them as much as we can. So Tim, for working from home, where the home is a workplace and the person owns the home, what are the compliance requirements for the homeowner and the contractor when removing an engineered stone kitchen?
You've got a contractor involved, so that contractor will have to go through everything they need to do. But at the moment, you're limited to what you can do with engineered stone. What was the question asking removing?
Yeah, so it's what are the compliance requirements for the homeowner and contractor when removing an engineered stone kitchen?
The contractor needs to notify SafeWork SA that they're doing the task. There's a online portal access to do that. That scope of works would need to be made aware to SafeWork SA. The contractor will have to follow all the silica and engineered stone regulations, and that benchtop would be removed and disposed of. That's about it.
Next one.
Yep.
Question from Claire Howard. I understand other regulators may be considering approving silica awareness training if it meets or exceeds the criteria of the regulations. Would SafeWork SA consider this to provide a more accessible pathway to education, similar to the current regulatory requirements for asbestos awareness training requirements?
My apologies to Claire for not following up with her in relation to that question previously, but I did discuss that with Brett, and at this stage we don't have capacity to take on 1,000,001 people applying for approval for training packages to be delivered. So at this stage, we're only accepting the nationally accredited training that we've approved, and the option to review that space maybe in 2025 will be looked at again. But at the moment, I don't have capacity, or the team doesn't have capacity, so it's a no, and I'm only accepting the national accredited training. But we'll go back and review it in 2025.
Okay.
It's noted that there's only currently one RTO delivering this training.
All right. Just going through all the old questions first. Stuart Lowe, if your controls are effective and air monitoring validates effective control below the WES, is this still considered a significant risk of exposure for the purposes of health monitoring?
For the purpose of health monitoring or air monitoring? So if it's health monitoring, and the regulations don't stipulate when the health monitoring must occur. So there's the initial health monitoring you do to establish a baseline of your employee and their current health status in relation to silica at that point. I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is in consultation with the doctor, a monitoring program will be established at that point, and that will be an ongoing requirement. If you do the initial assessment with a doctor, you give that doctor all the facts and the information. And to give you an example, okay, I work with house demolitions every day. I'm exposed to high levels of silica for 8 hours every day, 7 days a week, versus a worker who would go, I drill one drill hole in a house brick twice a year, and I'm exposed to that activity for all of 5 minutes at best, X amount of times a year. The doctor will go, okay, your demo guy is going to get health assessed hypothetically every year. The other chap that drills a hole once in a blue moon might be assessed every 5 years. Don't take that as fact of what I'm saying. I'm just using that as an expression for hopefully answering the question. The doctor will establish based on the facts and determine a course of action for health monitoring for an individual based on their ongoing monitoring and any changes and things they come across. Hopefully that's answered the question for you.
Tim Wilson asks, is the white card going to meet? Let me just close that quickly. And I'll get to that other question in a second. Sorry. Screen's being silly. Is the white card going to meet the minimum level of accredited regular approved training?
For silica, no, not at this point, not on more. Possibly down the track, don't quote me on this. Personally speaking, not the regulator speaking, there is logic in having silica combined into white card. That's just my personal opinion. That way all workers are made aware, in the construction domain at least, that silica and all other WHS issues can be applied to the white card. At the moment, there's no discussions on that. So at the moment, you need to do white card and you need to do this nationally accredited silica training in South Australia.
Okay. Stuart Lowe said, given there is no transitional period for the wider CSS regulations, will SafeWork SA take a reasonable approach to those PCBUs who are currently working on their RCS risk assessments and RCS control plans in consultation with employees and their representatives?
We will try a soft start. So at this stage, there's no campaigns in 2024 in relation to silica. In 2025, the construction team will deliver a silica-based campaign that may run for 18 months. It will be, and I'll be honest, I haven't got this put together yet, so I don't know what it looks like in the final context. The construction team will try and soft start with all PCBUs. The reality is at the moment, if I receive a complaint in relation to silica dust by, and I'm using this as an example, you do a house demolition, I attend, or an inspector attends site, there's no controls in place whatsoever, dust clouds of silica going everywhere. The inspector's under obligation because the silica regs are there that you must stop the activity. That's the reality. I'm speaking very candidly. If you're not got your ducks in a row for your regulations, but I'm not getting complaints in relation to your activities, speaking candidly, good on you, you've flown under the radar and you continue to work on getting your ducks in a row to get those levels of compliance with those regulations in place. If it's brought to my attention and if it's warranted, I'll expect the inspector to prohibit the activity if it's that warranted. And there are PCBUs out there that is warranted.
This question sort of flows into this next one, so I'll just read it out quickly. Russell Sharp has said, is there a transition period in regards to training requirements due to there being only, I'm assuming, one training provider at the moment?
Technically, there's no transition period for the regulations. I did actually speak to CITC in relation to how much uptake and how busy they were. At this stage, they explained to me that they run the course as a on-demand scenario, and it was explained to me by CITC that they've had minimal, limited uptake in this. The course is certainly not running continuously. So the options, other options available to you, SafeWork SA accept an online version of the qualification, the national accreditation. There is a provider out there that does that. That option is available to you. There is, if desperate, the option to bring RTOs from interstate into South Australia that are qualified and allowed to deliver the training in SA. That is another option. At this stage, there's enough options there for you. But I acknowledge there is only one provider, and that personally concerns me. But I haven't spoken to other RTOs out there, and there may be other RTOs looking to get this course under their accreditation to deliver it in this state.
Not really a question, but Anna has stated in the chat as well. I emailed CITC and they outsourced the course to Creative Safety Initiatives.
I wasn't aware of that.
Is it still accredited though? If they're, yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. We'll have to look into it.
I'd have to look deeper into confirm whether it's tickety-boo, but I'm assuming it is.
I'm just about to share all the, because there's no other questions at the moment, so I'm just about to share all those links that Stuart has mentioned in the presentation. About to hit send now. It's in the chat. I will share it in the Q&A as well. No, I can't do that. Collapse that. Oh, good. It's in the chat. If you have any trouble accessing those links, I'm going to hang around for a little bit after the meeting officially ends, just to make sure that everyone can click on those links. Richard, is there anything you'd like to add before we start to wrap up or take any more questions?
No, I don't think so. I think Stuart has fielded most of those questions very ably. Yeah, if there are bits and pieces that come through in the chat that George is gathering, then we'll look into that. And if there's a need to reply to some of those on an individual basis, you know, outside of the frame of this meeting, then we'll do that and we'll follow up on all of the technical questions that come through.
Q&A here. It is being recorded, but the presentation we don't distribute the actual PowerPoint, just in the case that things change, and yeah, it's just not something that we share. But the recording will be available, I believe, Stuart.
I believe, yes.
Yeah. Another question in the chat. Chris Harrington, believe Alert Force does the online training for 10830 NAT. Yeah, I was looking at that before as well, Chris. I think they do as well.
There could be more providers out there from an online perspective. I acknowledge I had to look for the one that I found, and I don't recall their name off the top of my head. I'm sure there's more out there, but when I did a Google search, I didn't come up with 20 options in one on the first page, unfortunately.
Yep.
So I think you will have to do a bit of diving to look and locate those online providers. But yeah, they are out there. SafeWork SA will accept online training in relation to the silica regulations.
I did miss a question before and someone's answered it as well. William O'Callaghan has asked, and Richard, you may be able to answer this as well. Is there times when real-time air measurement techniques is acceptable to the regulator, e.g. the dust track type real-time monitoring? What do you think about that, Richard?
I'm glad you raised that point. Yeah, it has been quite a controversial and hot topic, the concept of real-time monitoring. I think at the moment, the official line, and this is a view shared by pretty much all of the Australian government occupational hygienists, is to say, yes, it's a useful tool. It's an adjunct to assessing the static and personal airborne sampling. Those are the validated techniques at this moment in time. Yeah, I think some of the methodology is not fully validated and not fully calibrated, but certainly it's a tool that sits alongside the validated techniques.
And I think Ryan's mentioned that as well. He said, I don't think the regs specify, but I believe they can be useful in determining hotspots if paired with the conventional samplers, such as like your normal monitors that you use for air monitoring for asbestos and whatnot.
Yeah, that's right.
Haven't seen any more questions coming through. Nothing in the Q&A. I'll hang around for another 5 or 10 minutes just in case anyone's got any additional questions. Stuart might hang with me as well, depending.
No, I'm out of here.
He's out of here. He's done.
Sorry.
No, you're right. And I think on another note, it wasn't a question before, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Tim, 12 minutes ago, had told us we'd done a fantastic job, gentlemen.
Just to all of industry or all those out there in the webinar now, I personally acknowledge these regulations are fairly new. Just as everyone out there is scrambling to come to grips with it, I'll speak for the construction team because we're tasked with the asbestos domain and construction activities. I have tried to focus this webinar around those two domains, and there's simply a reason for that the majority of the complaints that our team respond to are based around demolition and asbestos removal activities. Under these silica regulations, both activity types have duties in the context of a simple, straightforward deep six fence. When you do your assessment, you may very well come out the end of it purely because the inherent controls that are built around asbestos removal actually make the activity of a straightforward deep six fence removal not a high risk activity. Alternatively, you may have to take to tiles with a jackhammer in someone's home to access asbestos tiles under that tiling. I have seen that before. So you've got to take it on a case-by-case basis, but you still need to cover those regulatory requirements and assess it to reach a conclusion whether it is or isn't high risk. For the demo guys that progress or do demo alone or progress from asbestos to demo, I got to be honest, from my perspective, you guys are in the thick of it. You're really up against it. You've got a broad range of types and activities to deal with that need to be assessed. There's not enough knowledge that I'm aware or evidence out there to say that a garden hose is going to cut the mustard for managing that house demolition. I personally don't believe it does. You are likely going to have to do a lot of air monitoring to get your baseline evidence to start determining whether people are at risk and the actual controls are effective in doing what they're doing. And I don't believe you just want to rely on a hose and someone wearing a mask. I think you need to start looking at higher engineering elimination controls. And I'm referring to someone sitting in an excavator for an 8-hour day or a 7-hour day bashing down properties. I would genuinely look at pressurised cabins if you're going to expect them to sit there with the cab door closed on a 30-degree plus day, wearing a mask with no HEPA filters, etc., sucking in dust from a demo activity. I think you're setting that worker up for failure. I think they will be impacted long term. They will be impacted by silica. And also you faced your biggest headache in the general public domain. Every next door neighbour is your worst enemy in the context of any degree of dust falling into their property, and I have seen a marked increase in the wording put through in a complaint. It's no longer just a dust complaint, it's a silica dust complaint made by a complainant. So that's what you're up against. I personally recommend air monitoring in the form of static air monitoring. Might be a great tool to prove to a neighbour that your controls are effective, but that's just my personal belief and how I would personally manage it if I was in that situation as a demo contractor. So I hope this presentation or this webinar serves some value for those who aren't working in the asbestos and the demo domain but sitting in on the webinar. I hope you've got some value out of it. You're going to have to take these regulations into the context of your activities and your tasks. They still all apply to you if you're dealing with silica, and the reality is most materials out there, 1% or more, that's pretty well most of what we work with and play with in the real world. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your patience and listening to my monotonal delivery, and I hope you've got some value out of it. Thank you to everyone.